Well, good morning, everyone. I'm watching very familiar names flash across my screen, and it's a pleasure to see you all joining us. I'm going to say a couple of introductory things about the community of practice, and then we'll jump right into today's session. For those of you who don't know us and haven't been part of this group previously, Community of Practice is now 6 years old, 900 people strong, and proud. And we operate 9 working groups, as well as this set of conversations that we try to sustain across all of us, in part because we believe that there are often lessons to be learned from one sector that have applicability in another, and also the true conviction that we're really stronger together. So for those of you who are not currently members of the Community of Practice, this is a very wide, arm open invitation to please come join us. There's no barrier to entry. You just need to go to the website like you did to sign up for the event, and you're now part of the Community of Practice. And it's exactly that way that we've grown. It's an almost entirely voluntary effort. It's a labor of love for those of us who are involved in it, and it's been really a pleasure. I'll speak personally, it's been a real pleasure to watch how this has grown over time. I'll say a couple of words about the Community of Practice, but then I want to just bring to your attention that we are going to record this session. It will be available to any of you afterwards who might want it, but we're also going to make it available more generally. So just forewarned is forearmed on that. The other thing I'd like to say is that in session 1, plenary 1, which was on Monday, there was a fantastic use of the chat box, honestly, way beyond my expectations on that, sufficiently so that we're going to make another little product out of the conversation that went on in the chat box. We'll anonymize people's comments, but we really thought it was wonderful. And I want to put in a plug for people doing something similar today. It's totally up to you, but the chat box will be open throughout the session. And if you have a thought, a comment, a question, please use it. And we'll encourage those of us who are the speakers to respond back to the extent they have the channel capacity to do that. We'll also take this as some indication of issues to look into after as follow-up items. And if you want to answer each other, please feel free to do that as well. As I said, as somebody who's very old with facilitation, but relatively new still with this online facilitation, it's wonderful to see everyone talking at once and have it not be talking over each other. And I learned a trick, I learned a Teams trick that I'm going to teach anyone who doesn't know it, which is that if you're going to comment about something that someone else said, if you're continuing a conversation, rather than just come in sequentially, if you hover over with your cursor, hover over the comment you're responding to, you'll get some emojis, including 3 dots. And if you go there, you can reply in a way that will keep the comments together, like it becomes a chain, rather than an editorial task afterwards to try to reconstruct the chain. So if you think to do that, go ahead and do it. If not, we'll be glad to reconstruct that after the fact. The introductions of people in this are going to be necessarily brief because the session's crowded, but I take some comfort in the fact that you have longer bios on the website. We encourage you to go look up more about the people who are going to be speaking. It's a really genuinely distinguished group of people, and we're grateful to them for doing it and grateful to you for being here. So let me just say a word or two specifically about introducing today's session. For those of you who were with us on Monday, you could think of this as Act 2 of the play. Act 2 of the play that's got 3 acts to it. The 3 acts represented by the 3 plenaries. So the whole process began at the last year's annual workshop, where there was, again, I thought, a super interesting conversation, both among panelists and also among all of you who are listening in. And after that, we decided to go back over the 12 recordings and try to extract themes that really jumped out at us from this. And we commissioned Richard Cole to try to pull those together, plus some thoughts of his own. And we ended up with what I thought was a really good survey of the landscape on really cutting edge issues on scaling. Out of that, as a community of practice, we chose 4 to look at in some detail. And this workshop is looking at some depth at those 4. In the last of the plenaries, which is going to be on the 23rd, after all the other events have taken place, we're going to take stock of that, see if people think what we've done has been useful, ask some questions about whether people would like us to stay on those same themes or move on to some others, and if so, what those others might be. So in plenary 1, we talked about one of those themes, which has to do with the relationship between the perspective of systems change and the perspective of scaling. Are they two different ways of approaching things? Do they have something to teach each other? I won't spoil the punchline, but I will tell you that we identified a continuum of arrangements between systems change perspectives and scaling perspectives. At the one extreme, the kind of social engineering notion that scaling up is taking an innovation and simply growing the size of that innovation. At the other extreme, the idea that unless you reform the entire system, individual innovations are unlikely to have a major effect. And in the middle of that, something we call transformational scaling, where the people who are doing the scaling not only are cognizant of the system, but are looking for opportunities and taking opportunities to make incremental improvements in the system. Today, we're going on to items 2 and 3 of the conversation. And for us, 2 and 3 are put together because they make a whole. So item 2, the first one we're going to be talking about, call it Act 2, Scene 1, talks about how things get institutionalized in governments. How does that process actually happen? And we start from the proposition that most things, if they're going to really go to scale and stay there, are going to be sustained either by governments or by markets. In this case, we're focusing on governments. And we're asking, well, how does that happen? And you're going to hear, I think, a really interesting portrayal of that process. I'll come back to it in just a moment, but just to say that John Floretta is going to be facilitating that conversation with Rajan Nived, Noam Angrist, more to say about that in a moment. The question, though, is how come this happens so infrequently, and what can we do to improve our record of performance in trying to take innovation and truly see it fully and completely and sustainably lodged within government. The second part is going to be led by Johannes Lin. He's going to be led by Laura Giron, with speakers being Johannes Lin, Gwen Hainsworth, Rob McLean, and Elaine Tinsley. This one looks at institutionalization, but of a very different sort. This looks at how a focus on scaling gets institutionalized within donor organizations. Where, as you'll hear in part 1, sometimes scaling is not donor dependent at all. But in many of the cases that a lot of us deal with, donors play a very prominent role. So for us and for the community of practice, it's been an ongoing issue. What can we do and what needs to happen in order for donors to really see scaling as central to what they do and embody it in the way they do it? So since both of these things have to do with how do you make organizational change permanent, and how do things really get lodged and stay lodged within organizations, we see them as being two pieces of the same conversation. And if you look back at the literature that's been evolving over the last year, you'll see a whole series of things, mostly maturity models. Look at what's involved, what are the dimensions of this kind of institutionalization, whether in donor organizations or in governments, and how do we track and catalyze those sorts of changes. That's today's conversation. The final piece is going to come in plenary number 3 on November the 23rd. And that's looking at backing up from all of this. What principles or standards or criteria or lessons can we extract from experience to date on scaling that might be generalizable across circumstances and across actors on this? Again, we've been working on a thought product on this. We'll share it on the 23rd. We totally invite commentary on this. As far as we're concerned, we're doing this for you and you're doing this for us, and we're all trying to move this thing forward together. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce John, who will take over as the moderator for this session. For those of you who don't know him, John is Global Deputy Executive Director of JPAL, where he also heads their Policy and Communications Group. For my purposes, it's also very important to note that he co-chairs with me the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group, where we've been doing a lot of work on this issue of institutionalization in host governments. John, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Larry. And I want to get to the insights that we're going to hear from Rajni and Noam. So as Larry said, like the first part of the session is going to focus on government systems and institutionalization. And by that, we mean like to the extent a program or initiative is not only like being scaled by government and continuing to deliver impact, but is being sustained and being baked into government systems and processes, so it's genuinely owned by government. Now, this of course can happen without partnerships with donors, NGOs, consultants, think tanks, and that happens all the time. That said, we have a prior in this session that in many contexts, having what we're going to call an intermediary organization to support the government, not only in helping the initial processes of scale, but also kind of helping to bake the program into government processes and systems. So in this session, we're going to shine the light, and I don't think either of them would necessarily call themselves intermediary organizations, but I think using the framework of scale we're thinking through today, I'm going to go ahead and make that assertion that both the National Health Systems Resource Center, which Rajni used to lead in India, that collaborates with the Ministry of Health to provide implementation support to scale community health programs nationwide, and the NGO in Botswana, Young Love, which collaborates with Ministry of Education to support them in scaling an evidence-based remedial education program in primary schools. So going back to Larry's continuum, so there is a difference about where these innovations, where the programs being scaled were originated that it's helpful to note. So in the case of what Rajni is going to discuss with the Indian National Health Systems Resource Center, the community programs were designed by Government of India. Government needed support in rolling them out and integrating them into the government systems in the ministry, and she's going to speak about that. In the case of Young Love in Botswana, the government had a priority for remedial education, but the innovation that now government is scaling originated outside of a government context, actually outside even of Botswana, and it was Young Love first directly implementing it and then playing a role in transferring it. So that's what's different. I think what's common as in both of these, which may not be common in all contexts, is you have two very strong organizations with very deep partnerships with government, and it's not, just a funded one-off project to try to scale a particular model. It's these long-term partnerships and serving as intermediate organizations to help government sustain and to scale. So that's what we're going to hear from them on. And so let me introduce Rajni and Noam very briefly. So Rajni Ved she's currently an independent public health consultant. She's the former executive director of the National Health Systems Resource Center in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in India. And her expertise expands policy development, implementation research, technical support. She has a degree from Madras University and a master's from public health in Harvard. And Noam Ingris's interests center on bridging the gap between rigorous evidence that can enable youth to thrive and translate into scaled intervention and policy. He's the co-founder and the executive director of Young Love, and he is currently a fellow at University of Oxford, where he did his PhD and was a Rhodes Scholar. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Rajni and Noam a few questions. We're going to hear a little bit, start off by what their organizations are, understand a bit about what types of support they've provided to governments to institutionalize and scale and build these models into systems, but then also get them to reflect a little bit about government ownership, whether or not they transition their organizations out as these models are scaled and owned by government, and what it means to lead a kind of intermediate organization, and what are some ingredients that they think are keys to success that might be relevant for us as we try to build these types of organizations ourselves or fund them or learn about them. So without further ado, Rajni, let me turn to you And so could you just describe what is the role of the National Health Systems Resource Center? What initiatives was it designed to support the scale of? And, from an outside perspective, like why is it needed? Why didn't Government of India, Ministry of Health roll out these programs without an implementation support partner like the National Health Systems Resource Center?
Thank you very much, John, and good day to everyone who's here. It's a pleasure to be a part of this group. So, John, just to answer your question, I have to take you all back 15 years ago when the Government of India launched. We had a political party in power that had just been elected in 2005, and one of the commitments was one community health worker in every village, and the large-scale infusion of government funds into the health sector by creating a large-scale health system strengthening program. When this was launched, India's health programs were largely vertical, limited to maternal newborn child health and a few communicable diseases programs like malaria, tuberculosis, leprosy. Now, despite these programs, India ranked rather poorly on the MCH indicators. And this was increasingly attributed to a lack of systems approach to improving health outcomes. So the introduction of the National Health Mission was really to bring a systems approach to health, which requires a skill mix to apply system design principles and complex adaptive approaches to a lot of health problems. It was also intended to rapidly scale up evidence-based practices and pilots that had proven success. India is a federal structure. We have 35 states and now about 1.4 billion people. So you really need to very rapidly scale up innovations that happen, of course, contextualizing them across the different domains. So that, and concurrent with the design of the National Health Mission, there was a large-scale donor or development partner, as we call them in India now, led effort to design a reproductive and child health program. Now, this was fairly vertical program, but this was led by the World Bank, UNFPA, the European Union, DFID, and other bilateral and multilateral organizations. But these four were the big players. And the government then, so they had designed this reproductive and child health program, which was then integrated into the National Health Mission. And the government tasked the donors with creating a technical assistance mechanism. And the donors had also asked for it, saying we need technical assistance to implement the reproductive and child health component within a health system strengthening platform. So the government, told them, figure out how you're going to do this. And so and I was part of this so many years ago, but to look at so they decided to create a new institution or advocate for the creation of a new institution, which would channel technical assistance from each of the donors. As you know, donors all put in money. And even though India's funding for health is largely domestic, mostly domestic, there's a small component of technical assistance that the development partners fund. And their understanding then was we would channel technical assistance and NHSRC would be the body that would receive all this technical assistance fund and then, farm out technical assistance the way it was required. We were basically intended to be a body shop, if you will. And the idea was also, of course, that we would support other aspects which the donors were not supporting. And this would be originally funded by government, by the donors, and then to a large extent, and then some small component by government, but progressively, increasingly be absorbed into government. Now, two things. The government was wary of creating new institutions in the country. So we were set up as a society, which is how non-governmental organizations are registered in the country. But very early on, we realized that donors had mandates and agendas, very vertical. So UNFPA, for instance, did family planning and reproductive health. UNICEF did child health. And while the World Bank gave us a big loan to do reproductive and child health, they were not exactly equipped to provide the kind of technical assistance that was needed. And plus, scaling up all of these innovations for multiple component interventions really needed intensive handholding and monitoring and support in the field, district, sub-district, or subnational levels, if you will. And the development partners did not have that expanse. They did not have the bandwidth to be able to do that. And so quite early on, much before I think it was intended, the entire responsibility for funding shifted to the government. The government realized that they would have to fund this effort. And so that's why NHSRC has almost from the beginning been completely funded by government. And we see ourselves as a boundary organization. And now, and I want to make a slight distinction between intermediary organization and boundary organizations. And there is a lot of literature on boundary, but the way we defined ourselves was we were a mediator between practice, collection of evidence, and linking back to policy. So this triad of practice, evidence, and policy, which actually has three distinct players: the practitioners, the researchers, and the academics and policymakers. And so NHSRC, we saw ourselves as the center of this triad and linking all three of them. And I think one of the reasons that NHSRC has survived, and not just survived, but thrived, because we now provide technical assistance not just to the National Health Mission, but other different arms of government, is that there's a credibility because we have no agenda except the outcomes that are aligned to the national program. We don't have any other mandate except supporting this. Second, there is this legitimacy which comes from being fully government funded. Of course, it leads to some power hierarchies and power wielding, which we see, but that's part of the course, I guess. And the third is its relevance in terms of having professional teams, multidisciplinary teams. We were able to get together multidisciplinary professionals, and we are set up so that we have junior consultants going out to the field and actually watching the implementation or monitoring. Then we have mid-level consultants and senior advisors. So we're able to meet the needs of practitioners and the needs of policymakers by having this mix of teams that are able to do multiple functions. So the boundary nature. Now, I just want to give you one example. Do I have time? Am I okay with time, John?
Yeah, you have a couple more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so just one example of scaling up. So NHSRC did a lot of things. We don't just support community health work. We provide support across the domains of the health system. So it could be human resources for health, health financing, health technology assessments, but the community processes component and the quality assurance component are the two of the key features or the two key program interventions that NHSRC supported. So for the community health worker programs, before 2005, India had two sets of CHW programs, one implemented by NGOs across the country, but which spanned small populations. The second was the history of a failed community health worker program in the 1970s, which didn't take off. And so when in 2005, this community health worker program was introduced, there was a lot of skepticism among program managers, particularly, and mid-level program managers, that this would just fail. But NHSRC support, and it was designed by the government and a whole lot of stakeholders, but the actual implementation of this was supported by NHSRC, whether it was development of guidelines, support in the field, taking it back to policymakers and constantly rejuvenating in a sense to help scale up. So what started off from a pilot of, done by various NGOs to actually having 400,000 in the beginning to now almost 1 million community health workers. So that's really the way it was scaled up, but all of it had to do with the way we were structured and organized and the way we were funded. So I'll stop there now and wait for other questions.
Yeah, the next question I'll turn to Noam in just a second. I want to hear what types of support you provided. I'll turn back to you in just a second for that. But some of the things that are salient from what you explained to me is just that government of India is going to roll out a massive community health program as part of the National Health Mission. It was originally some ideas of how it could be donor funded. There was a decision that to channel the donor money, but then to support the ministry, there was going to need to be some type of, what you say, boundary organization. Government ended up fully supporting it. But we'll come back to this. You and the team that you built, you weren't civil servants. You were, and not everyone saw themselves as probably government officials. So you real kind of are playing this technical support role inside government, but also have this kind of identity outside. And so we'll dive into a little bit of the types of support you provided. Now, Noam, we're going to talk a little bit about how you in Young Love has been increasingly partnering with government and connected to government, but you didn't start there, and why don't you just give us a background on what Young Love is, and including your mission on scaling evidence-based models through youth?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me here, and it's such a treat, and I think such a riveting discussion, and it just gotten started, so I can't wait for the rest of the hour. Yeah, Young Love, we are one of the largest NGOs in Botswana. We scale up evidence-based health and education programs that enable youth to thrive. And we really work hand in hand with government. So we have a standing memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Education to scale up evidence-based programs nationally. We also have an advisory board that's chaired by the former permanent secretary of the Ministry of Education and has senior officials from many of the key ministries and development partners, including Ministry of Health, Ministry of Youth, as well as the UN agencies, some of the missions. And I'm going to speak a bit about our Teaching at the Right Level work, because I think that's going to be the focus of this discussion. And I think it's a really, I'll share actually the story of how we came to it. So I'll share about Teaching at the Right Level, but how we started working on it. So Teaching at the Right Level was actually pioneered in India by Pratham, one of the largest education NGOs in India. And the basic idea is that education systems are often structured by grade level, but not every child is at grade level. And so, for example, we found in Botswana in grade 5, only 10% of kids could do basic 2-digit division, which is, just barely grade level. So the vast majority of children are not at grade level, yet year in, year out, they're taught the grade level material. So one of the key insights from Teaching at the Right Level is that if you, instead of teaching the kind of arbitrary curriculum that's a bit ambitious, you actually assess the students, you see who can do addition, who can do subtraction, multiplication, division, who can read a story, read a letter, and you group them by their level for an hour or two a day, and then target instruction to their level. That's a real game changer. Instead of the material sort of flying over their head for the 8 hours a day, now they can grasp it and they learn very quickly, very, very quickly. So that's the idea. And Jay Powell has evaluated this over 20 years in 6 randomized trials and shown it's one of the most cost-effective interventions. Okay, so how did we start doing this in Botswana? Well, our advisory board, which was chaired by the permanent secretary of education, Grace Muzila, convenes every year. And one of our core philosophies for how we work is we really respond to the national need and the government interest. And she said test scores are plummeting. We've managed to get lots of children into school, but very few of them are learning. Our learning levels are behind neighbors like Kenya and Zimbabwe. We really need to do something about this. Can Young Love go and find an evidence-based program that's been shown to work, that's cost effective, and can you pilot and test and adapt it and work with the government, and we'll scale it up together? And we came to Teaching at the Right Level because it was extremely cost effective, very evidence-based, very translatable and adaptable. And then we started to see, is it going to translate to our context? So we actually did a census in 2 regions of the country to see some of the key conditions. Like, was it the case that truly children are not at grade level? Was it the case that there was a lot of variation within the classroom? So grouping was really important. If those weren't true, you might not need Teaching at the Right Level. So we verified those conditions, and then we piloted and adapted the program, made sure we had a cost-effective model, and have worked with the government to scale it up. And so we have now reached 20% of primary schools in the country, and we're on track to reaching every single primary school in the country by 2024. So it's been a very exciting journey. And we're also an innovation hub for a scale up of this approach across Africa with Tall Africa, Teaching at the Right Level Africa, where our role is to test and tweak innovations, show what's possible, and kind of work with Tall Africa to train others and be a site of an innovation hub where folks can be inspired and support others as they're scaling up these efforts. In terms of our scale model, and then I'll pause on this, we have a dual scale model, and I actually love this term, the boundary organization. I think that really kind of captures how we think about our partnership with the government. We have a direct delivery model where it is facilitators that Young Love as the NGO hires and trains. So there's a little more autonomy there. And they deliver the programs and services. And then we also have a government-led model. And the direct delivery model is very intentionally, and I'll come back to this later, it has a very intentional size. It's big enough that it can create waves, and you can learn about things that are scale. So it's not 2 schools, it's a bunch of schools. It's about 10% of schools in the country, 5 to 10%. But it's also small enough that there's no way it's going to eclipse the system. We're not going to create a parallel scale-up model. And so it really is to find that sweet spot of sort of generating that interest, that attention, those lessons that are translatable, but really making sure the main scale-up is going to happen through the government system. And the government-led model is a fusion model. The government has a national service program which deploys 15,000 young people into schools and clinics. And in schools, they're essentially teacher aides, but they're underutilized. They're actually sometimes asked to kind of wash floors and dishes. They're not actually asked to teach very often. Sort of like a youth welfare scheme instead of a youth corps. But they're there and they're willing and they're available. And so we're working with them, as well as a few teacher champions in each school. So it's kind of a hybrid model, and they're delivering it at national scale. And our co-founder, Moitepi Machang, is also the chairperson of the government's national service program, ministerially appointed at permanent secretary level position. So kind of wears a dual hat that relates to this scheme. And so that's the idea. That's kind of the interplay. So we respond to the government's demand, we pilot, we test, we show what's possible, we generate a cost-effective model, and then we work with the government to provide technical assistance and support through the government-led scale-up. The final thing I'll just say on that before I pause there is this is a distinction. It's actually a little bit fuzzier in practice, the distinction between the direct delivery and the government scale up. So for example, for the government scale up, we second staff to the government to support that scale up. For the direct delivery, the government actually pays for over 50% of our direct delivery actually. So it's not quite, it's not fully sort of NGO actually. They cover all the venues, all the training, much of it is actually also owned and seen as part of just the government scale-up effort. So it's an important distinction, but it's a little bit fuzzier in practice.
Thanks so much, Noam. Some of the things, compare the NHSRC example and Young Love case in India. Like one thing that's similar is that you just see these really deep connections with government, and NHSRC is part of government, but still has relationships with originally at the donors, is still bringing some new ideas to government and helping to shape, share evidence and helping them to design. I think has a big focus on implementation support, especially at the state and at the district level. For programs that government is rolling out, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about that. Young Love is very much an independent organization with these, but you have government chair your board, your co-founder has a hat with government, you're collaborating with them, and I just do want to call out this one thing that you're doing at NHSRC is direct implementation, because you are an NGO, and I've seen that. With other organizations too that are collaborating as intermediary partners with government. So Living Goods announced its next 5-year strategy, and they have the same kind of idea. They're going to continue to do some limited direct implementation of their community health worker programs, basically like as an R&D, a place to kind of push the boundaries and look at R&D and evolving the model. But then their main collaborations are in partnerships with several governments in Africa. So the next questions, and these can be a little bit more rapid fire to both of you. I just do want to unpack a little bit about what is the type of implementation support that both your organizations are providing. And so when you look at like the process of institutionalization defined by government, part of it is like having the capacity to implement. And so I'm kind of curious of what's the type of implementation assistance that you have found has been particularly helpful to provide as kind of an intermediary or a barrier organization. What does that look like? So Rajni, can you start first, and then we'll hear from Noam.
Thank you. So I think if I were to single out just one critical feature of our implementation support, it's really to get the tacit knowledge, because there is really very little space for integrating tacit knowledge of practitioners, especially government practitioners, whether it's service providers, whether it's community health workers, whether it's district program managers, into programs. And program managers and service providers are really often seen as recipients of training rather than people with valuable knowledge, and that's really the tacit knowledge. And I think that's been one of the big successes of NHSRC, is that because we are structured to go deep into the subnational level, we are able to pick up this. But of course, in addition to all of this, we draft protocols and guidelines that are evidence-based and operationally feasible. That's what we like to say. Our guidelines, yes, they build in the evidence. Of course, we are evidence-based, but we make sure that the guidelines are in a language, and I don't mean language, but something that the practitioners can really understand. So it's targeted towards practitioners, not so much towards policymakers. Number two, we follow up through orientations and implementation support. So it's literally transacting the guidelines at every state. We also do advocacy for change and explain the program to everybody who's concerned. So in the beginning, we literally had to do multiple state level workshops because this involves great change. So scaling up a pilot involves great change, and people are resistant to change. So you have to keep advocating for it. And as I think the MSI toolkit says, shining a light on it the entire time. But also the second piece, which is preventing disruption, because there will always be, people who are not champions of the system, who are really resistant. And so preventing disruption is also a very important part of what we did. And I can't go into it now, but there was opposition from the Indian Academy of Pediatrics to allowing community health workers do certain things. So we also had to deal with that. Also showing some early gains and providing positive feedback to implementers, but also to policymakers to say that this thing is working. Don't be in such a hurry, because all policymakers are in a hurry and want to see things happen overnight. So we had to feed them those early gains, but also be cognizant that there's a lot of work to be done down at the ground level. Monitoring and rapid appraisals, of course, building up teams at the state level. And I know, John, you talked about the fact that how do you hand over this? I think in the Indian context, there's no handing over. It's a federal structure, so we have to strengthen state capacity. And I'm amazed at the way in 15 years, states who were resistant to the idea of community health workers now have large teams in place who've actually institutionalized the community health worker program. So that's one important part of what we do. Two things I'd like to mention is identifying innovations as they occur in the field. Practitioners do things that seems to them to be intuitively right. They're addressing a certain problem in their field, and we look at it as an innovation. They actually look at it as part of what they did to make something happen. But to identify those innovations and to be able to disseminate and share across all states, that's something we do. And to this point about direct delivery, yes, we don't do direct delivery, but 3 years ago, the government of India launched a primary healthcare program, and we knew this meant a great shift. It's from selective to comprehensive primary healthcare. And so we set up 5 laboratories called the Innovation and Learning Centers, which were essentially set up to look at change management. We set up small teams, and these were through NGOs and academic institutions, who set up people at a sub-district level to actually say, Richard is distracting me with the chat, but I will speak to that later. So the change management role was walk with the implementation team. Don't interfere, support them when they need to, but document the change that's required to move from the selective primary healthcare approach to comprehensive primary healthcare approach. And so that is our way of direct delivery, if you will, but these are innovation and learning labs for us. So that's the way we provide the support.
Great. And I think that it helped me understand a lot more what NHSRC does, because I might have had a naive or a linear interpretation that government is going to roll out 1 million community health workers. It's made this policy, and a lot of your work would be kind of top down, describing the protocols of how that could happen and guidelines. What you're saying is also like you're taking, kind of bottom up as well, like the experience from practitioners and helping that to change what the actual policy is and the guidelines of what's rolling out. And also being a platform amongst Indian states and union territories and experience to learn from each other on the rollout. And that's very, very important and impressive. Noam, how about you? If I was just going to try to understand the nuts and bolts of the implementation assistance that you are providing, say not the direct implementation model, but like on the teacher-led or government-led model, what are the types of things that you're doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. And John, I'm also trying to keep up with the chat, but let us know if we should or.
So this is maybe not a best practice here. Maybe we can see how we should do this. I'm not looking at the chat at all for now. I'm just looking at you two guys. And what we should do, and because I want to bring the perspectives in, is I'll ask Larry to keep an eye, not to respond to the chat, but I'll turn to him instead of asking one of my prepared questions. I'll turn to Larry to kind of maybe bring in a few different perspectives from the chat and ask you guys, because I'm not a talented multitasker. I can only focus on this. So yeah, so why don't you tackle what is it? What are the nuts and bolts of the types of support that you provide?
Perfect. Yeah. So I hear you on. I actually would argue that direct delivery is part of the support, and I actually want to start with that point.
That's great.
And I think that this is also where it's distinguished. And so I'm going to mention 2 or 3 things, but this is the first one.
Great.
There's others that are not direct delivery, but this is this is where it's distinct from a pilot project. It's part of the scale up process, actually, and I'll get into what I mean by that. And I'll start with a story here. When we were starting this, the Deputy Permanent Secretary, which in Botswana is the institutional memory and kind of person in the ministry. There's more rotation at the Permanent Secretary and ministry level. So this is an individual who's been there, for decades and kind of has run many of the systems, and the Director of Basic Education. They said, if this is going to scale up successfully, actually, we can't just say, hey, all teachers, please do this. We've actually done that many times, they said. And, the typical response is, we have way too much on our plate. We're already overworked, we're already stretched, what is this thing? And so they anticipated that. And they said, the way we would rather do this, and Botswana is a size where this is also possible. So, we'll have to extrapolate to other settings. They said, we want you to go and just deliver it and show people that change is possible. Maybe to Rajni's point of sort of get gains early. I mean, it's sort of it's this fuel to people's belief that actually some change is possible. Show people what's possible and get them excited about it. There's nothing like seeing children happy and kind of enjoying and learning to bring energy into the system. And then the teachers will say, let's do this. And then we'll do a national training, and then we'll announce as the government we're rolling this out. So that was the plan, actually. And we got to a point where we started to deliver it to 10% of schools. And indeed, what the Deputy Permanent Secretary and Director said, it was amazing. They predicted exactly what was going to happen. Suddenly there was energy, there was enthusiasm, and actually there's no better training than seeing the actual program happen. It's much better than sitting in a room and being told here's how to do it. You now have seen the program, actually. So it's actually serving many purposes. And then the director said, this is going to be part of our core education reform efforts. And there was actually a scene where there were hundreds and hundreds, up to almost thousands of school heads in a room. And they said, who's received this program? And 10% of hands in the room go up. And there was this huge momentum and energy. And from there, we were able to continue. So I think this initial spark is actually very critical. It actually provides very concrete, maybe some of the best training. It creates a kind of a buy-in and a change mindset, which is often one of the hardest parts of this whole thing. So I would actually say this is part of the core support that we provide. And something I should say, actually, is the direct delivery we do rotates, actually. So we're not in the same schools every term. It's like a fertilizer. We actually rotate every term because often once the spark is there, it actually takes off within the system. It's kind of amazing. And so it actually rotates, and it's sort of this fertilizer approach. So that's one thing I would say about direct delivery. And the final kind of point I would make around that before I touch on another aspect of support that we provide is, I think sometimes, just like kind of in monetary policy, there's this, no trickle down, right? It's sort of, there's this notion that things don't just trickle down. It's the same thing here. Successful in our experience so far, policy change, implementation change doesn't just trickle down. It has to be top down and bottom up, and kind of, it's a sandwich. It meets in the middle. And so that's our experience. So we have the MOU, we have the government structures, we have the high level kind of frame and approach, but there's also a bottom-up demand and a grassroots movement, and they meet in the middle. Sure. The other thing I would say is, and I'll pause after this one, is providing resource teams as well as resource toolkits. And so we actually have learned that even seconding 1 or 2 staff members to a region, which is not very much actually, can make a really big difference. And so we've seen that that's a really critical part of the support, is having these resource teams and really strong relationships, in addition to really good implementation guides, really good M&E frameworks. And so I just wanted to emphasize that point of the resource team as well as the resource toolkits.
Excellent. This is really helpful. I think what I'll do is ask you one more question. If I could maybe just get you, you're not gonna be able to answer it in full, and then I'm gonna turn to Larry to bring in some perspectives from the chat, and then I'll have a final question, so as I know we have to end on the hour. So maybe my final question, Noam, you go ahead and start this one first, and then I'll turn to Rajani. Is like you both talked about some of the nuts and bolts of like the toolkits, the guidelines, the resource people, direct implementation to show what's possible, being a knowledge platform for learning in different regions. Can you tell, when we look at the MSI institutional tracker, to help us assess whether institutionalization and ownership is happening, you see these other dimensions like kind of leadership and budget and kind of an awareness of the broader political economy. So my question, and you're not going to, and just to get maybe whatever one or two examples you want to cite, and then I'll ask the same to Rajani, is like on that level, beyond just implementation of the program, what's maybe an insight from your experience? And feel like, to the extent you can share, like, as Larry said at the beginning, I think scale-ups are not often successful. And so take us a little bit behind the scenes, if you could, about like what you think has been some of the secret sauce when you have been successful, and what you learned from that.
Yeah, definitely. So 2 points here. One, I would say, and maybe they might contradict, so I'm going to put them out there and tell me if you feel they're contradictory, but that's maybe will generate good conversation. One is, I would say, we have seen the value of some institutional frameworks to buffer some of the personnel shifts, which are a very common part of the system that we experience. So we've worked with 4 permanent secretaries during this scale-up process, having MOUs, having a convening that's chaired by the Director of Basic Education that convenes regularly. This is also part of our partnership with Tall Africa and Brookings. Those are really helpful to help deal with. It sort of puts a little bit of structure on the very art of doing this. There's lots of things you can't predict or control, and so it creates some structure to help keep things moving. At the same time, one of our great principles, actually, I think, is follow the leader. We have seen that we have to follow the leader. And so we had a very successful government-led scale-up in the Southeast region. And when that regional director moved to the Northeast, which was not actually on our list initially for the next region to scale up to, there's many things you could prioritize: need, urban-rural split, many things. But when that regional director moved, we moved with him. And it was a bit of a risk, and we did it quickly because he moved quickly. And he said, "Come with me, please come with me. I want to bring teaching at the right level with me. We can scale this up." And this is the second biggest region in the country. And we did. And that's one of the most successful government-led scale-ups. And amazingly, and here's, I think, a testament to it, not only within a few months did he get it up and running in nearly all schools in the region, and were the results actually as strong, and in some cases stronger, than direct delivery. So sometimes we see that the direct delivery is maybe stronger and governments may be more at scale, but not as strong. It's actually not what we're seeing in the Northeast. Under this leader's leadership, it's actually as strong. It's amazing. The other thing is, during the COVID pandemic, which has been the ultimate disruption, of course, this region, actually, as soon as schools were closing, would do these assessments to make sure they knew where the kids had left off. And as soon as schools reopened, would assess again, see where the children were. And in some cases, about 80% of kids would come back innumerate or illiterate. It was very high rates. It was quite scary. And then they would do teaching at the right level immediately. And within a term, those rates would go down to almost 0%, in some cases 4%, 3%. I mean, it was really dramatic gains. Schools would then shut down, as we know there have been many waves, and they would do it again and again. And this was an environment where it's actually quite hard for us to provide as much support because it was fast moving. You couldn't be in person as much, but the region had it so institutionalized and so embedded that it kept running, actually. It kept running and it sustained shocks. And I think that's been one of our lessons is, institutionalization is the ability to keep results at scale through shocks, actually, which are common. Even this was a big shock. So all that is to say, I think sometimes the leader thing is seen as sort of, oh, well, there's just a few sort of charismatic leaders and you can't replicate that and you can't scale that, and but actually I think you can codify that principle. You can identify your movers and shakers and you can work with them. Now, obviously there's trade-offs. You also want to work in regions where you don't have your movers and shakers. But the final note I would end on with this is what's been interesting is that region is now the model region for other regions. And so other regions in the government-led scale-up see that region as a model and aspire to that. And the regional director in that region is working with other regions. It's actually no longer intermediated just through Young Lav. It's actually now intermediated by the model government-led region. So I'll just end on that note.
Super helpful. Rajni, your perspective, like when you look at not just kind of the implementation support, but these kind of more macro factors of leadership and governance, and from your own experience of like the secret sauce of when things stick and grow, could you share with us in just a minute or two, like what couple minutes, what your reflections are on this piece?
So first off, I'd like to say so much of what I was going to say Norm's already said. But, the difference, I think, is because NHSRC is a creation of the government. There are some features of the NHSRC that enable it to function the way it does. So the autonomy, a very clear mandate, but the ability to evolve that mandate, a governing board that's headed by the secretary and has both public health experts as well as people from the states on it that continue to keep us in line and make sure that we're delivering, but also are very open to our suggestions on evolution of program. And I think NHSRC has contributed to that. But in this whole issue of leadership, I think Norm's absolutely right. There's no one single leader. We found people at the district level who've been amazing at nurturing. In India, our district is about 2 million. So been amazing at nurturing the community health worker program there. There have been state officers. So our role has been to bring together all of the states, but make sure the leaders got to speak. And so the champions got to speak. But we also used some other mechanisms because this was a political program. I mean, a community health worker is at the level of 1,000, 1 per 1,000 population, and is often, it's fine. They're members of the political cadre. It's across the country and we have different regional parties. And early on, the prediction was this is a politically driven program, but I think that stood the program in good stead. So every parliament session, we get 150 questions on the community in the early years, not anymore because the program is so institutionalized now, but parliamentary questions, parliamentary committees on the working conditions of the ASHA, which we used to great effect to make policymakers who didn't want to support the ASHA financially be forced to do that. So I think those were the kind of tacit experiences. And the way we use champions, whether it was the Planning Commission in India, whether it was some state that was just not moving, to use these kind of, instruments to be able to nudge them and push them and move towards this. So I think that's the way the tacit experience of scaling up has been for us.
These are just such fascinating examples of how you've had very politically astute and capable organizations working at multiple levels and helping government own and sustain these innovations as an intermediary partner. Larry, I know we're almost kind of running against time, so maybe I'm gonna cut myself off and pass over to you. Could you bring in a couple of perspectives in from the chat? Maybe share your own perspective and then give the final questions that you'd like to ask to both Rajni and to Noam.
I'm actually going to deviate from that slightly because there was a great suggestion in the chat for how we might carry on this conversation. The suggestion was if Rajni and Noam could stay with us during the second hour and actually run back through the chat themselves and respond to some of the issues that have been raised, people would really welcome that. If you can't, we understand. We'll try to find another way after the fact, but I thought that was a great idea. I'll tell you what some of those issues are just to prepare you. There were questions raised and discussed a little bit around the role and limitation of pilot projects for trying to work with government. More generally, there was the questions about what kind of evidence seems to really be dispositive with government. What does it really take? You touched on that, Noam, in terms of talking about direct experiential things, but beyond that, what kind of evidence seems to work in this? There were questions about crosswalk to the budget, to the government's budget process, and how that works most effectively. There were questions, and I myself am very interested in this one, in how these relationships with government evolved, even in the case of Rajni's situation, where it's situated in government. I know from my own experience that there's always a kind of a backstory to this in terms of how it happened and how it was possible in the first place. And to the extent you're able and willing to share any insights on those, I could tell people were really interested in hearing about that. I'll make just a comment myself by way of transition to the next conversation, because I want to make sure we don't cut short on that. And that is that this notion of moving from countenancing something to really owning it is a much bigger divide than I thought it was. Namely, government's willingness to say yes to something that's not harmful is a much lower threshold than its willingness to really own something that it's dedicated to not only continuing, but as Noam put it, to sustaining through the shocks on this. And it's a very limited number of things government can say yes to in that way, and trying to figure out what they are and how to really align behind those things is a big part of what I see is the backstory to what we're talking about right now. A second thing that I think is really useful is people have asked about tools and approaches that could be generalizable. On purpose, we picked two cases that are really quite successful here because we think there's a lot to learn from these cases. A lot of people are not blessed with as strong a hand as each of you were able to play in your respective environments. And by the way, I'll say this editorially, I think you're to be enormously commended as individuals in helping to create that situation in your respective countries. But be that as it may, most of us don't have that. Most of us are entering a different way, where perhaps there's a donor-funded program which shows real success in RCTs or in the eyes of the people who've put it forward, and they're hopeful of trying to crosswalk that to government. What can we do if we don't begin with the relationship that you've obviously evolved to try to help make that possible? Of course, I'm inviting you to respond in the chat box now, but that's a big question. And I'm hoping we as a community of practice continue to hang on to that one for a while as we move forward. I'll say one last thing, and then I'm going to thank you and introduce Laura to chair the next part of the conversation. But I'll say that this issue of institutionalization has made it into the core concerns of this community of practice. For those of you who are going to be able to participate in the conversations over the coming week and a half, you'll hear several of the working groups have picked this up in very particular ways. For example, the education group has really grabbed this one. And those of you, whether you're education sector or not, if you're interested in this topic, stick with them, because that's exactly where they're going to go in their session. We in the monitoring and evaluation group, likewise, are going to take this as our subject area and look at what we can say from an analytical point of view. What do we know about metrics for looking at institutionalization? What do we know about the way that evidence crosswalks to the process? Only by way of saying that we're inviting any of you who might be interested to stay with us through this journey, both during this annual meeting and afterwards. We're not going to let go of this one until we feel like we've contributed to whatever we can on it. So I'm going to use that by way of saying I thought that was a wonderful conversation. I mean, really, really, really wonderful. I had high expectations. It was better than that. And I want to thank John, Rajni, and Noam for making that possible. And I hope you're all going to stick with us for the second half, because again, the second half in a way is a continuation of the same conversation, but with a different optic. This optic is, if you bring donors into the equation in a way they were not central to our last conversation, how do we use that to help propel this process? And to lead that conversation, we're gonna have Laura Giron, who a number of you I know, but I'm going to say just a little bit about by way of introduction. Laura is the president of Partner in Expanding Health Quality and Access, and she's also a member, and has been for a long time, of the ExpandNet Secretariat. For those of you who are not from the health sector, I can tell you we all learned from ExpandNet along the way somewhere, and Laura is very prominently associated with ExpandNet and has been. For our purposes, it's very relevant that she's co-chair of the Health Working Group and a member of the Executive Committee for the Community Practice. I'm not going to take the privilege of introducing the panelists that she's working with because I know she's going to do that. But I want to again thank the last group and welcome the next one. Laura, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry and John, Noam, and Rajni. That was also, that was truly an incredible conversation that brought so many new questions, and we hope to continue answering them, as Larry said, through this community of practice and our collaborations with all of you. So I am really excited to welcome everybody to this second half of the plenary because as Larry was saying, this is just a really exciting space and venue for sharing. We're encouraging the chat for using for sharing resources and ideas and comments, and of course questions for our panelists. And I wanted to remind everybody that we probably will, as we're doing with the first plenary, we will share anonymously the chat proceedings because that was a request of one of the participants on Monday's session. So that was how valuable it was. So please do take that opportunity. And also, of course, we'll share the slides although there weren't any slides today, but the session recording will be available afterwards. I also want to say that in about 30 minutes, I'm going to turn to the questions that you are posing to our panelists. And in doing so, I'm going to ask, since the chat is going to be hopefully very active, if you could help me by posing a question as a question. It'll help me find it more easily to share with our panelists. So as Larry was saying, our session now is going to turn to the issue of mainstreaming a scaling up mindset, and now within donor organizations. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to ExpandNet because, well, first, for anyone who's not familiar, as Larry was saying, ExpandNet is an informal and highly welcoming global network that we founded in 2003 to help advance both the science and the practice of scale up. And as Larry indicated, I've been serving since that time as a member of ExpandNet Secretariat. Also, while this year's annual meeting is just jam-packed with amazing learning and sharing opportunities, I was personally really excited about this panel because for so many years now, ExpandNet members around the world have been saying how critical it is that donor-funded initiatives squarely serve a scaling up agenda. And even while we all know that scaling up is complex, it can take a long time, any funds that are invested really can and should help us progress along an appropriate scaling pathway. Of course, there's a place for trying out new ideas and approaches on a small scale, but we know that even when we do that, there are ways that we can undertake those activities in more or less helpful ways that advance future scale up. And if we recognize that donors can sometimes have an outsized role in setting that agenda, then we can also encourage donors who fund global development work to do so in a way that sets the stage for scaling and or purposefully advances the scaling up process in countries. And all of our speakers today have been doing exactly that, and that's why it's such a pleasure to give you all the opportunity to listen and engage with them. So, of course, it goes without saying that donors are diverse and a heterogeneous group, and of course our panel represents that today. And because grantees and award recipients and country stakeholders don't automatically have all the necessary skills and capacities that scale up demands, if donors are encouraging that collaborators work with a scaling up mindset, then the likelihood is greater that contributions will be meaningful. We know this because there are so many pilot projects carried out over decades that truly withered away when funding ended, in part because donors hadn't encouraged such a mindset. I keep referring to a scaling up mindset, so I do feel obliged to define it. And I'm going to paraphrase a definition that we put forward in a recent article that Expanded and the USAID funded Evidence to Action project laid out. And that is that scaling up mindset is one that recognizes the importance of the following four things. One, taking a systems perspective while designing and implementing interventions. Two, ensuring ownership of the initiative by government and other local stakeholders. Three, undertaking activities and investments in ways that contribute meaningfully to the national program. And four, limiting external inputs to what can be maintained or mobilized when implementing on a larger scale. And as Larry was also doing, I want to preface the session by recognizing that all of today's panelists, and I know you as the participants and future listeners, may be inspired by a wide and growing number of helpful frameworks, approaches, and tools. And for certain, we all come to the scaling issue with a passion to advance global development in ways that respect human rights and dignity. Now speaking with my hat as a member of the Community of Practices Executive Committee, we all agree that this diversity is a great benefit. As those of us in Expanded often say, it really doesn't matter what technical approach or framework you use. What matters is that you use one to help shape your scaling endeavors, because in doing so, you'll harness existing knowledge about what makes scale up succeed and fail. So this is certainly the case for our four panelists today, all of whom come to the scaling issue from different vantage points and all of whom bring highly inspirational learning and experience. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, who perhaps for this audience requires no introduction, but I'm going to do so anyway because it's such a pleasure. Our very dear colleague, Johannes Lin, is a longtime thought leader to the field of Scale Up and is the co-founder and co-convener of this community of practice. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a distinguished resident scholar at the Emerging Markets Forum in Washington, D.C., among several other senior posts that he holds. So from 2005 to 2010, he was the director of the Wolfenson Center for Development in Brookings, which is where he did a lot of his foundational thinking and writing on Scale Up. And this was after nearly 3 decades of prior work at the World Bank, where he served as Vice President for Financial Policy and Resource Mobilization, and as Vice President for Europe and Central Asia. Johannes has his doctorate in economics from Cornell University, which I only learned about this week. We're all so lucky to hear from Johannes on this particular topic because he has thought long and hard about the role of donors in advancing Scale Up, several insights of which he's about to share in his remarks. And he will also lay out for us how we're using this term mainstreaming in this context. So over to you, Johannes. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, and welcome to everybody. It's kind of speed dating today, and like Larry said, actually, you know, we look forward to having some of these conversations like this one on mainstreaming, scaling into donor organizations, continue in the specific sessions that the working groups are pursuing. So, as Laura said, my contribution this morning is very briefly to summarize a few takeaways that I have after maybe 30, 40 years, I have to hate to say, of experience working inside donors and a donor organization, the World Bank, for 30 years, and working for the last 15 plus years with actually a number of donor organizations, multilateral, bilateral foundations, and international NGOs to help them as best I could from the outside to introduce scaling into their organizational framework. So what are some of my takeaways? Let's move on to the next slide, please. The first question that I would like to briefly comment on is, so why should we worry about mainstreaming scaling into organizations? Well, the answer is very straightforward. Organizations are needed because individual actors, yeah, are helpful, but really it's organizations that are needed to scale up, to support scaling up, to finance scaling up. And therefore we require, and we really need that organizations, not just individuals within organizations, but organizations that currently work on scaling need to adapt their organizational approaches to reflect the scaling agenda. So organizations are critical to scaling. Now, what about specifically donor organizations? Why should we worry about those? Well, again, it's very straightforward. And as Laura already said, donor organizations can help recipients in many ways to scale, not only as funders, of course, that's critical, but also as champions, as capacity builders, as intermediaries, and as coordinators. And I would say actually for the funding organizations, because the funding organizations themselves have to attract funding from somewhere through replenishments in the case of multilateral organizations or in the budget process, it's actually very helpful to be able to demonstrate that your impact is at scale and actually goes beyond purely your monetary contribution into supporting sustainable impact at scale. So it's actually in the own interest of the donor organization to be able to demonstrate that it is a scaling organization, an organization that supports scale. On the other hand, of course, we also know from painful experience that donors can hinder scaling processes on the ground with what is too often a one-off project focus, focus on short-term impact, a focus on what I like to call pilots to nowhere, and of course, the pervasive lack of coordination across donors operating in the same broad area in a particular country or particular sector. So what we need clearly is an effective systematic approach to scaling by donors. That's really absolutely critical. Next slide, please. So where is the scaling agenda in the current organizational practice of donors? I like to distinguish 5 broad types of integration of scaling into organizations. And you see it on the slide here from right to left. You see these circles. Let's start with the right. And here we have scaling, which is basically intrinsic to the organization, meaning it's fully mainstreaming practice throughout the organization. Now, there are some organizations, as far as I know, that do this, that vertical funds like the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, perhaps, and there are a few others who are in this particular stage. The Eleanor Crook Foundation for Nutrition, by the way, as a research funding organization, I think is characterized also by this particular type of full mainstreaming. If you then move to the left, you come to a situation where where scaling is at the center of the organization. It's owned by the leadership, it's part of the mission and strategy, but it's not yet fully integrated into operational practice throughout the organization. This may be the case with IDRC, and we'll hear in a moment from Rob McLean, who is a scale-upper at IDRC, how he sees IDRC in this context. Is this a good characterization? As you then move over further to the left, you come to a situation where scaling is being pursued in an organization somewhere. In the organization, maybe by 1 unit, maybe by 2 or 3 units. The World Bank, I think, maybe USAID are good examples, where some particular units are pursuing scaling fairly systematically, but it can't be said that the organization as a whole is pursuing scaling systematically. As we continue left, you come to a situation where scaling, innovation scaling, is at the periphery of the organization. This is typically the case with the innovation and accelerator labs that, for example, DFID has, UNDP, World Food Program, and so on, where you have a separate unit that worries about innovation and maybe hopefully scaling innovations, but actually have little impact and little connection to the day-to-day operations of what might be called the mothership. And finally, you have a situation which is really not mainstreaming at all, where you have outside actors, consultants, or advisors or whatever, like myself, for example, in many cases in the past, who are trying to assist institutions to actually introduce and move towards a scaling process in their organizations. Now, typically, as I look at my experience in the past, and about 10 years ago, I looked at this systematically, I haven't recently, I think it's fair to say that the majority of donor organizations currently are towards the sort of left three, somewhere the left 2 or 3 of the circles that you see on the slide. But there are a few that are toward to the right. And I'm happy to say that also, and maybe this is partly the effect of our community practice over the last 5-6 years, that actually there's been a movement from left to right, I think. And the question then is, how do you actually continue that movement and intensify the movement over time? Let's move on to the next slide, please. So how do you actually go about changing the situation? How do you go about mainstreaming scaling into a donor organization? The first thing to realize, I think, is that actually organization mainstreaming is kind of a scaling process in itself, and it involves 6 steps typical for scaling, and you see them, the 6 steps on your left side of this slide. First, you need to create a shared vision. For example, as part of a mission statement. That's an important first step, but it's not enough, obviously. You then need to develop a systematic approach to scaling that is appropriate for the organization and its mission. And here I think it's critical that we find ways to adapt the standard one-off project model to incorporate a systematic focus on sustainable scaling beyond project end. A third step is to strengthen the enablers for mainstreaming in the organization. The champions, leadership from the top, staff incentives are important, and partnerships within the organization, but also across the organization among those who believe scaling is important. Fourth, you need to reduce barriers in the organization, bureaucratic inertia, staff overload with new fads or buzzwords. There are costs to this, including training and staff overload that have to be addressed, so budgetary issues. A fifth step is to take appropriate action and follow through over the long haul. That's the actual implementation of changes. That takes time. And very importantly, as you go along to try and mainstream, you need to monitor and evaluate whether actually you're progressing. So it's important to realize this does take time. It's not a one-off, one month, 1 year, but it's actually a multiple year effort. It takes persistence and it faces risks of discontinuity, especially with changes in the leadership in the organization, similar to what we've heard earlier with institutionalization in government. So the question then is, and the next slide, please, is how do we develop a systematic approach to mainstream scaling in an organization, a donor organization? And here, in my experience, we need to take 3 main steps. The first step, the top rectangle there, is to review and assess current organizational practices from scaling perspectives in 5 areas. First of all, vision and strategy. Is there a focus on scaling? Funding operational business models, especially the project cycle and the financing instruments, the second area. Thirdly, what are the internal policies, operational policies, also personnel policies, management processes, and staff incentives. Fourth, one needs to look at the guidelines and the training instruments. And very importantly, again, one needs to look at the monitoring and evaluation approaches of the organization. The second step, then, having done this review and assessment, is to make sure in one way or another that you align the practices that you've reviewed and where you've seen shortfalls from a scaling perspective, to align these practices with a scaling agenda. And thirdly, regularly monitor and intermittently evaluate the mainstreaming process. That's actually a process that IFAD has followed, actually something like over a 10-year period. I'm afraid for various reasons, perhaps with mixed success to date, but I'm hopeful that IFAD will continue on this journey. Now, next slide, please. As you go through this process, in my experience, you run into a number of common objections. And let me briefly summarize them, and to some of you, they may sound quite familiar. The first one, and this is particularly for large organizations, the response you tend to get when you want to talk to your colleagues in these organizations about scaling is that, well, we're big and we're already doing it. When you talk to organizations that are relatively small, NGOs and so on, they may feel, even if they don't tell you, well, we're too small, we can't really worry about scale and scale impact. Another common response from staff, particularly in organizations, is that, oh, it's just another fad. Let's ignore it because management will change and this issue will go away. And so if we just hunker down and get on with business as usual, things will be just fine. And too often, by the way, they're right. The other response you get from staff when you engage them on this topic is to say, well, my management, the board, the authorizing environment, they only care about the project impact, not about the longer term impact at scale. And so, yeah, I may try, but it's really not going to be helpful in the context in which I operate. And then, of course, there's always budget concerns. Our frontline is already overloaded. We can't add this to yet another dimension to our work. So another objection that you have to tackle. And additional response, we may be more silent and not outspoken, is that as you, especially if you're an outsider to a particular organization, or within an organization, you try to tell an operational unit, why don't you change the way you do business? Don't tell me what to do. Why would you know any better than I'm on the front line and I do what I do and it's the best way to proceed. Then when you have specific tools that you convey and want to, and operational guidance, the response sometimes is, oh, it's too generic, it's not helpful for my particular case, or it's too complex and burdensome and I can't really be bothered, I don't have the time and resources. So somehow or other, you've got to figure out how your guidance and your methods, your tools that you propose actually fit the particular need and the particular ability to apply in the organization. Finally, a problem that is pervasive in organizations, they have a hard time keeping track over a longer period of whether or not their institutional changes, and in this case, the scaling approaches, are actually implemented and working as intended. So there are a bunch of difficulties and objections that you have to deal with. And let me close my presentation with some brief lessons that I want to share, 10 of them very briefly, that I took a takeaway from my experience in trying to get donors to focus more systematically on scaling. The first is, and going back to Laura, it's focus on changing mindsets of managers and staff by showing them that the systematic approach to scaling will help them achieve the shared development objectives more effectively. Actually, in my experience, despite what I said earlier, the average frontline staff is very open to the idea. They know that this is not rocket science. They just need the right support, the right incentives to actually make it work. The second lesson is, remember, the scaling is about more and better development impact and not necessarily about more money or bigger organizational footprint, which is actually very often how organizations react when you ask them to scale. Yeah, give me more money, or yeah, I need a bigger organization, I make my organization bigger. But that's actually not, as we know, what it's principally about. The third lesson is develop an approach that responds to the specific needs of the organization. And it's most really helpful and very important, I believe, that the own managers and staff are in the lead, not the outsiders, in trying to effect this organizational change. Focus, fourth, on integrating scaling into the project cycle with a special focus on what happens beyond project end. Fifth, provide practical guidance and training to staff and, very importantly, consultants, because very often actually consultants are doing the work rather than staff. Keep sixth, bureaucratic processes as simple as possible. We have a tendency to overload bureaucratic processes. Allow more risk-taking, recognize that lack of success in projects is an opportunity to learn rather than a failure. Link up with clients, partners, and funders in pursuing the scaling agenda. Monitor and evaluate in the mainstreaming process. And finally, stick with it because it's going to take time. I have a last slide, which you can briefly put up, please, which gives those of you interested the journey that IFAD went through in its effort, long-term effort to try and mainstream scaling. I'll be happy to discuss this further if there are any questions, but I won't go through it now. Thank you. Laura, over to you.
Well, thank you, Johannes. Those were really tremendous insights, each of which we could dwell on for a lengthy period. But I do want to introduce you all to our other three panelists. But before doing so, just remind everybody to please use the chat box liberally. And if you pose questions, really put it as a question for me. So our other speakers have all gained substantial experience with scaling from within their respective donor organizations, as well as in work that preceded their current positions, which of course they bring. We wanted to give each of them 5 minutes to address the journey that they and their institutions have been on with regard to mainstreaming a scaling up focus. And they are going to highlight some of the successes and some of the challenges and learnings along the way. So our first speaker will be Gwen Hainsworth, who's a senior program officer on the family planning team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And in her new role on the Drive Impact at Scale initiative, she manages a portfolio of investments that are focused on scaling up family planning high impact practices. And she leads a strategic partnership with the World Bank, including the Global Financing Facility. Prior to that at the foundation, she was Senior Program Officer for Adolescents and Youth, which is a subject very dear to Gwen. And she has managed a portfolio focused on innovative solutions to address barriers to young people's access to family planning, and gave strategic direction on scaling up evidence-based interventions for this population. Gwen comes with 25 years of experience working on sexual and reproductive health and rights for adolescents and youth, and on gender from 18 countries across across Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Caribbean. Gwen, go ahead, over to you for 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura, and it's really a pleasure to be with everyone. And I'm apologizing ahead.
Gwen, I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. Why would that be? Is everyone else hearing her, Rob? Not well.
No.
A little louder. Maybe it's the headset.
Is this better?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think the device settings were off. But I also wanted to apologize in advance for my voice. I seem to have come down with something over the last day or two. But it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I just wanted to say from the outset, I'm going to make some remarks on behalf of the foundation writ large, but because the foundation is very large, I feel like many of my remarks are going to be more restricted to the experience of the family planning team, which is where I sit. You know, in reflecting on Johannes's slides, I was trying to figure out, okay, where do I think the foundation fits within, you know, the continuum? And I would say it's probably somewhere between 2 or 3. Probably closer to somewhere in the organization. And so I'm going to speak to that a little bit. So, you know, if I think about the foundation in the early days, you know, kind of stepping back, the foundation really saw its comparative advantages developing new technologies or drugs or vaccines. That was kind of the value it would bring. And then I think the idea was then that would be scaled up by others, either via private sector or governments. And some of this thinking, to be honest, still continues. However, I would say a big part of the foundation's own learning has been, you know, really understanding that scale up doesn't really happen that easily, and that the foundation has a key role to play in supporting scale up. However, how that plays out really differs across teams. And part of that is because at the foundation, and you know, I'd be interested to hear from others on the panel if this is similar or dissimilar, but strategy drives everything, which means all of our investments or grants need to align to a team strategy. However, there's a lot of diversity across teams in terms of their strategy, which can make mainstreaming scale up challenging. So there are some teams like the family planning team where I sit that include an explicit focus on impact at scale. But then there's other teams that may have a strategy that's more restricted to a learning agenda that's either focused on research or data generation. In a case like this, mainstreaming scale up may be less relevant. And so, you know, I thought it might be helpful to talk about my team in particular and kind of the journey we've had. So for the family planning team, we've had a focus on scaling up both under our new strategy, our old strategy and our new strategy. And our new strategy is new as of this year. And in our old strategy, we were kind of, the team was organized and then funding essentially was organized across different initiatives. And so within that, we had an evidence initiative that was focused on, either proof of concept or proof of implementation, where our investments were essentially supporting testing new models or solutions to address barriers to contraceptive access and use. We also had another initiative that was focused on accelerating impact at country level through scaling evidence-based interventions. And in theory, the idea was, well, once we had demonstrated impact of a new model or new solution, it would then kind of move over and be scaled up under our accelerating impact initiative. However, if I'm going to be candid, this actually rarely happened in practice. And if I think about why I think that is, I think part of it was due to organizational structure and even somewhat silos within our team. Some of it was our investment processes and timelines. And then I would say also just a lack of a systematic approach to scale that cut across the whole team. So you had some folks that were really focused on this within the team, but it wasn't like everybody in the team across initiatives were thinking about our approach to scale. And I'd also say there's some politics as well that kind of came into play. That said, I also think there was positive steps in terms of our own growth, in terms of incorporating assessments of potential scalability into our evidence investments, which was relatively new for us. So really looking at the degree to which there was government buy-in, the feasibility to implement these solutions under existing conditions, the ability to integrate them into existing systems, as well as quite a few of our investments included pretty rigorous costing assessments as well. And then there was also a movement under the Accelerating Country Action Initiative with team members looking at a collaborative effort around what changes are needed in the system to achieve impact at scale. So I think all of that was positive. And then if you can just throw up in the chat, I have one slide on our new strategy because I think this might be helpful for folks to see a visual. In our new strategy, we have basically different initiatives that are ranging from an early stage of developing new methods or innovations to implementation research to demonstrate potential scale of interventions, to strengthening country and global scaling levers to support scale up of proven interventions in our priority countries and beyond. So, again, I think this is a more kind of systematic mapping. I still think we need to do a lot of work going forward to really map out how this is going to be executed with a scaling mindset that's mainstream throughout so that we don't repeat what had happened under our last strategy. And then two other quick things just to point out is that while we do have kind of this more explicit focus on scaling up within our new strategy, I'm not sure it totally aligns to how we've made budgetary decisions. So right now, more than 50% of our budget is going to upstream work kind of around new contraceptive technologies, which is the number 1 and number 2 on the diagram. And we have fairly limited resources that are actually being allocated for the stuff further to the right in terms of implementation research and driving impact at scale. So that's going to put a lot of onus on us to make really strategic decisions around how we're going to invest around scale up. And then the last point I want to leave you with before I shift over to another speaker is that there has been a foundation-wide shift that I think is really valuable for mainstreaming a scale-up mindset, which is this shift for around country ownership, building local capacity. And this has led us to shift from a very centralized model of grant making where in the early days, or even when I joined the foundation, all the investments were primarily made out of the Seattle office, to a more decentralized model with country and regional offices that have decision-making authority around the investments that we make. And that also as part of our efforts around DEI and decolonizing development, there's a real push right now to invest more with local partners. So I think all of these are positive. I would also say with any kind of new kind of organizational change, it's going to take us a while before we work out the kinks to make this effective. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Gwen. That was incredibly insightful about the developments at the foundation. We all can learn from the experience. So now I'm going to turn to Robert McLean, Rob, as we call him, who's the Senior Program Specialist at Canada's International Development Research Centre, IDRC. And he's also a fellow at the Integrated Knowledge Translation Research Network, which of course we love the name, and that's at the University of Ottawa's Hospital Research Institute. Rob is the lead author of a new book entitled Scaling Impact, Innovation for the Public Good, which presents a grounded framework and call to action for human and environmental advances. And Rob has his PhD in medicine from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So he's going to talk about how IDRC has been transitioning to a scaling mindset. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Laura. That's great. And thank you, Johannes. Thank you, Gwen. And thanks to the community of practice for the invitation and opportunity to be here. Laura, you're really going to have to cut me off if I get chatty because I've been inspired by the two other speakers, but I'm going to try to do this in 5 minutes. I'm going to begin with what the International Development Research Centre is. I imagine to many of you it's a new acronym, the IDRC. And so we're a funder of innovation and research for Southern Development Challenges and research done by Southern researchers. And so we're headquartered in Ottawa, Canada. We're a Canadian Crown Corporation, but we have 5 offices around the world that oversee and fund science and innovation. And so I do agree with your assessment, Johannes. I think we're about in that part of the continuum you suggested. And I'm going to try to give 3 reflections, maybe lessons, probably more experiences on how I think we got there and some of the things we learned along the way, rather than oversee the entire journey we took and all of the steps. And so those 3 things are about finding your niche. They're about finding the change you can make in your organization that scaling will support. And finally, about complexity of doing that. And so the first I'll turn to is finding your niche. And I think this was one of the things that helped us to bring scaling into the center of what we do at IDRC. So as I said, we're a research funding organization. And for us, one of the things that was fantastic for me was that in 2015, when we really identified that we wanted to make scaling a strategic part of what we do, we had to pause and reflect. And we thought, what difference can a small Canadian funding organization, to your point, Johannes, about challenges you face, make in this grand field? And so we thought, hey, maybe this isn't just about scaling up the work we're funding. It's also about contributing research, evidence, science to how we do scaling at large. And so one of the notions we've been building and trying to support is this idea of scaling science. And so at the same time that we're trying to scale the results of the science we're funding, we're trying to encourage, fund, and build a systematic, critical study of this process of scaling amongst our grantee community and contribute that beyond as well. So I hope some of you might be interested in some of that evidence from around our global community. The second piece is about finding the change that this represents for your organization to get buy-in and support for it. And since we were funded in 1970 and we funded mostly applied research, we heard a lot that, we've always cared about scaling the impact of what we're doing. This is applied research. We're trying to fund work that's going to make a difference for people or for the planet. And that's true. But what this shift was that really made this stick, I'm believing more and more, is moving away from the notion of how we're scaling the innovations we fund to presenting a framework for scaling the impact that we're contributing to. And it's a small difference in lingo, but it's a big difference in practice. It's moving away from scaling up the science projects that we've supported to thinking about that portfolio of projects. What are the impacts that we want to accomplish? And how do we syndicate that portfolio? How do we focus in on the scale of those impacts rather than the scale of supporting these innovations to get there? And this was a major shift in the way we've been thinking about measurement and management for the center. And then the third piece I'll touch on as maybe a lesson, but maybe more an experience for sure, is about complexity. And so it's really about, we've heard this morning and throughout the course of the life of the community of practice, in my experience, how scaling is a long, complex journey, and we can't just assume that it's going to happen overnight. I think mainstreaming scaling is likewise. And Johannes, I'm going to riff a little bit on something you said. You said that scaling is not rocket science, and I completely agree. But I think it's more complex than that. I think that scaling is a social science. And I think that that means it involves people, it involves perspectives, it involves organizations and systems, and it makes it a bit more difficult sometimes than controlled experiments. And so building that notion, embracing this lesson that keeps coming out of the community of practice about accepting complexity, taking a systems view of where your organization fits in the bigger scaling endeavor, are going to be things that over time are going to build that resilience, and I hope they've helped our organization to stick with this. And we'll see how that goes. But our goal, I guess, is to move a little bit further on your continuum, Johannes, because I think this is an issue that has helped us represent what we're trying to accomplish, to get better at what we're trying to accomplish, and support development globally at large from our unique position and our small role we can play as a research funder. So thanks for that, Laura.
And thank you, Rob. Very insightful too. So I'm going to turn to Elaine quickly because time is going too fast. And so Elaine works at the World Bank on sustainable and inclusive private sector development, where she specializes in women and social and climate entrepreneurship, and particularly focused on creating enabling conditions for scaling social enterprises. And Elaine has worked extensively on multi-sectoral government reform programs in Latin America and Asia in the World Bank's macro and fiscal management global practice. She has her master's in city planning and international development from MIT, and she's going to talk about how this work on social entrepreneurship has evolved to have a scaling perspective within the bank and what influence that has had in other areas of the bank's work. So over to you, Elaine. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thanks, Johannes, for inviting me to participate in the panel. I just want to put out a few caveats first to understand like where I'm coming from. So I'm not going to be talking about scaling up within the bank. As Gwen says, you know, these institutions are very large and I am a very small part of it. But we are going to look at, I want to talk about how we can look. So for us, actually, when we talk about scaling up social enterprises in the social enterprise sector, it's really about how can we use the bank as a platform for scaling. Because the bank works closely with governments, and they lend large amounts of money to the government. And the idea is, can we tap into that lending portfolio so that we can scale the innovations that are coming out of social enterprises? And scaling up for social enterprises is actually two forms. One is where you're looking at the impact that certain social enterprises are making, and can you expand on that, because that's actually going to improve the development outcomes within the country. And the other one is, can you grow the social enterprise sector so that you have more of these players within the country? So one is more of an ecosystem approach, and the other one is a more targeted sectoral approach. Like, can you work with the water sector or the waste sector? The waste sector is a great space for social enterprises because we see a lot of social enterprises active in that. And they're actually helping to achieve a lot of the development outcomes that the bank and the government is hoping to achieve by reducing the amount of waste that goes into the landfill, by recycling some of the, collecting and recycling plastics, paper, all these sort of things. And oftentimes it's happening now without any government support to these enterprises. And so I think for us, one of the key things when we were trying to support the social enterprise sector and to actually tap into the bank funding system is to be able to, first we had to like socialize a lot of bank staff on what is a social enterprise. And for those who may be less familiar with the term, social enterprises are really private sector entities that have a social mission. So basically, if you take a commercial enterprise and then you take an NGO and you kind of combine them together, this is what you would produce. A business that has a social mission to it. And the World Bank is, in a way, similar to a social enterprise. We are a bank, but our mission is actually very socially oriented. So it's that kind of mindset. Unfortunately, I think a lot with the government and within the bank, not so much within the bank, but there is a set between a commercial enterprise and an NGO. And it's very difficult to understand that there is that space between that you can tap into. Now, one of the bank's key initiatives is actually to increase private sector participation in development. And this is right where social enterprises come in. But one of the things we've realized is that, you need to socialize the bank on the concept. But in order to do that, you need to build strong knowledge base and evidence that social enterprises do work, that they are helpful. What is it that they do? How is it that they do it? And so we actually were lucky enough that the bank actually funded the innovation labs, which allowed us to invest a lot of time and money into developing this knowledge base on business models that social enterprises have used throughout the world that are a little bit stylized, so that we can understand that, yes, this kind of solution exists in this country and this country, and it can also be replicated in other countries. And so through that, we can kind of target different sectors within the bank, like either the water or energy, and say, these are the solutions that are coming out. These are the solutions that are really aimed at the low income markets to help you be able to solve some of the challenges that you're facing. Recently, we went to go visit one of the social enterprises in Kenya, where I'm based right now, for hydroponics. And they're teaching young mothers, single mothers, how to grow plants with very little water, very little energy, and not a lot of space. Kenya suffers a lot sometimes from areas which are very dry and very hot, and hydroponics is a good solution for them to do this. But more importantly, for single moms who have very limited income opportunities and who have to be close to home, close to where they can mind their children, this offers a solution for them to earn income. And so the business model is also designed to help these women to be able to collect harvest their crops and sell it into a bigger market. So I think when we can talk about these type of solutions, which is what was really key and important about having the knowledge base, then we can tap into the bank to kind of create that spark and energy that Noam was talking about earlier. Because when you go and you visit these places and you see the wonderful stuff that they're doing, then you can get the buy-in from the bank and says, yes, this is a great idea. We should actually be scaling these kind of ideas up, right? So it's not that the bank cares so much about the enterprise, but they care about the innovations that are behind it. But these innovations are normally have to be run by enterprises. And so I think this is our approach to, like, how do we get the bank to kind of buy into the agenda, and then to also work with the government. We've actually done training with government officials on what are social enterprises, what they can do to how they can help the country, as well as what are the policy tools that are useful for it. And the one thing that we are kind of running into problems is the disconnect, I think, between the bank projects and enterprise development, because we're not trying to scale up initiatives. We're trying to scale up enterprises, and that can be a little bit more sensitive when the government's saying, oh, you want us to give money to this enterprise, when, we could also be doing the development stuff. But if you can really play out on the outcomes that are coming, like the number of young single women that are getting employed, or the number of youth that are employed, then this is where we can get their ear and get their buy-in as well. And then from that, we can get the funding to go into these enterprises to help scale up the impact. So I'll stop.
Wow, really interesting work and a very interesting relationship there that maybe is not the typical work of the bank, but one we can learn from in terms of your experience, Elaine. So I'm going to turn now to a couple questions that Johannes and Larry and others of us brainstormed that we have for you, because we have many, and we want to also take some from the audience. So one of the ones that we were wondering about is, how widely would you say an understanding of and a focus on scale up is present among grantees or other recipients of resources from your organizations? Have you been encouraging them to focus on scale up? Yeah, can you just talk about the extensiveness of that understanding? Be really helpful, and the question's open for whoever wants to speak first. Anybody?
Sure, I'll jump in. I would say I feel like the situation amongst grantees is probably very similar to the situation I described across the foundation, which is I think there's a lot of variation. That's my experience. So we have some grantees that already, for example, are very well versed in ExpandNet framework and tools and taking a systematic approach to scale up from the very beginning. So even if it's a grant that is supporting, testing a new model, et cetera, they're already, in their proposals, et cetera, articulating how they're thinking about scale up and, things like bringing in government actors or other actors from the very beginning in terms of designing and testing the innovation, et cetera. So we have that on one side. And then we have others that will mention scale up. And it's not even clear that they have a systematic approach or any theory whatsoever to draw on in terms of how they would approach scale. So, whether or not they're really able to do that. And then there's others that I think still have very much a project mindset, because that has been what they've been funded to do for a very long time, and where scale up is really, almost like an afterthought or at the final stage. We'll get to the final stage of the project and then we'll bring in government stakeholders, et cetera, and show them what an amazing, model or approach this is, and then it will be adopted and scaled, which we know often doesn't quite work that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rob, do you also want to weigh in on this? Because, I think you're more at the research side, so it's probably even less common than maybe what Gwen is highlighting. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Gwen. That's kind of inspiring in a way to hear that it's similar mixed experiences. I'm actually going to point out, I feel this is also maybe a frontier of our challenge as a community, because there's given guidance and then there's learning from experience. And I wonder what the struggle is between the guidance we can collect from studying our experience, collate, give this back as tools or principles or frameworks, and allowing free and diverse innovation. And there's a balance in there. I'm not saying that we need to go one way or the other entirely. So I feel that is kind of a frontier challenge for helping our community to understand how important this is, because it's part of our mission, but also allowing that contextualized innovation that will make it work. So I think that's kind of like a discussion going forward in this community, at least in my view. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, Johannes, I saw your hand. Why don't you go ahead and weigh in? You have to unmute if you're still muted.
I'm sorry.
There you are.
Yeah. So Elaine, do you want to first come in on that question?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Sure. So when we have given grants to our social enterprises, I think for all of them, their key objective is actually to scale. Well, not all of them, that's a bit much, but they are looking to also maximize the impact, which is, I think, is the beauty of working with social enterprises. Is it's not about the profits, even though they need profits to stay in business. It is about kind of maximizing impact. And that's really aligns very well with what the bank is also trying to do too. So I think the more we can tap into the sector, the more sustainable outcomes we can actually create, and actually the more employment, especially for low-income markets. So yeah, it's all about scale.
So let me come back quickly to a question actually I was raised in the chat box, and that's about projects. So, do we actually have to abandon the project model and do something totally different? And my answer to that is no. You're not ever, donor organizations aren't ever going to give up the project model. It's just not going to happen in my experience. And what donors need to projectize, they need to have a time horizon, they need to have certain outcomes that they get with their support and so on. That's a given. What I think we need to focus on is, okay, are there relatively simple ways, at least to start with, to change the way that model operates? And so I have a few very practical suggestions. For example, just about every organization requires there's a midterm review. Well, traditionally, midterm reviews focus on what do we need to do to bring this project to a successful conclusion in terms of the narrow project objectives, reaching X number of people, making sure the money hasn't been malappropriated, et cetera, et cetera. That needs to change. The midterm review should focus on, among other things, not only what happens between now and the end of the project, but actually what happens after the project ends. Have we put in place the necessary conditions by which sustainability and scalability can be expected in, not with certainty, but at least with a reasonable degree of assurance? Do we have the relevant partners? Do we have the government board? Do we have the knowledge base that this thing actually works? Do we have a financing model that actually is sustainable once we pull our donor funding out? I mean, these are fundamental, simple, basic, and it isn't rocket science, in my view, to ask these very simple questions. Now, you can answer them at different levels of refinement and depth and analytical rigor. But to me, the most important is that we actually ask those questions at the right time. So a very simple change in the standard project model is to ask the right questions at the right time and make sure that somebody addresses. Another very simple change is in the independent evaluations of projects, which, you can argue, do they make a difference? I think they do make a difference because institutions do want to show that they're doing the right thing overall. Well, if you look at the standard evaluation criteria of the independent evaluation offices for most multilateral and probably bilateral organizations, scaling hardly ever exists. Sustainability does, and within sustainability, there's a very small reference, for example, in the OECD standard guidance on evaluation to scaling, but there's no systematic focus in evaluation on scaling. So let's change that. Let's have evaluators actually focus systematically on whether some basic aspects of scaling have been addressed in the project preparation and implementation. So I think there are actually a few very simple things one can do that aren't rocket science, that aren't terribly complex. And, let's start there and get on with it. Thank you.
No, I so value what you're saying, Johannes, because I've been familiar with evaluations that have explicitly had a focus on scale up and have not necessarily done that very well. And I think it gets back to the capacity issue, because nobody is really very well trained in scaling up. It's not like there's not a whole line of study at university, and the people who are leading these initiatives are at the top of their game from a technical perspective, but they don't necessarily have all of these widespread skills that scaling demands. That's the same is true of the evaluators. So we have to figure out how to elevate people's capacity on scale up, and maybe that gets harder as we have so many more frameworks. I don't know, but it's something we definitely have to solve. But I'm cognizant that we have 1 minute left and I really don't want to keep everybody late, but the chat has been incredibly rich with lots of exciting insights, and we want to leave that open for a few more minutes, but I think I have to close now on the fact that, of course, there's so many insights that were just touched on today from these representatives who come from different corners of this highly diverse donor community. They've conveyed cutting edge thinking and cutting edge approaches on how to support this transition to operationalizing of scaling mindset in their organizations' portfolios and in their wider operations. With any scaling up initiative, just like we're saying, internalizing a new way of working takes time, internal champions, which people have pointed to, sometimes help from external advisors, as in IDRC's case, which Rob conveyed to us earlier, can be really helpful. I want to also invite everybody to this coming Monday, as part of the annual meeting proceedings, the Technical Working Group for Health is which everyone is invited to join. We're going to be discussing this issue of mainstreaming a scaling up mindset from the other side of the donor equation. That's the technical and the implementing agencies who are the recipients. And so please feel welcome to join that discussion too. ExpandNet leads the Health Technical Working Group, and even if you come from other sectors, there will always be relevant experience from which you can learn. And just to close, I want to say that we're really all part of a growing movement that is really changing the development paradigm. We have so much to learn from each other, as well as so much work to do. And this relationship between donor and recipient can certainly be a virtuous circle with regard to scaling. It doesn't matter who takes those first steps towards a scaling mindset. It just matters that people do, and that we all move ahead in the most productive ways. So I just want to thank everybody for taking time to be with us today. We're very grateful, and we look forward to advancing the science and practice of Scale Up together. So thank you all very much, and please keep going in the chat if you have time. And thank you to our panelists for part 1 and part 2.
I want to come down on what Laura just said, but mostly as an opportunity to thank her and the panel for a very stimulating discussion. I feel like on this one, we may have just teased you a little bit. There's so much more that we could have said about this. And what I can say by way of reassurance is that we're just starting this topic. This is one of the topics within the cross-cutting arena that the community of practice identified last year, but did not really work on diligently during 2020 in the early part of 2021. We've teed this up as one of our primary areas for the coming year. So please consider this as the opening salvo of what I hope is going to be a long and ongoing conversation about this subject, pursued in some measure in the sessions in the remainder of this annual meeting, but pursued in earnest during the next year. So any of you who feel like being part of that, please consider this an invitation and please take us up on it. We promise to do our end. You need to do yours. Thanks so much, everybody, for a great session. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you, panelists and participants. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.